Welcome to COV-Course, a multidisciplinary approach to understanding the pandemic, coming to you live from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. My name is Gene Robinson, and I'm the Interim Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the Director of the Carl R. Woese Institute for Genomic Biology, two of the units that have contributed to the design of this course. It's my pleasure to introduce the Sunday evening session, and with it, some of the thinking behind the experience that we have created for you. The COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented public health crisis of proportions so huge that you can only really grasp it by taking a 360-degree view of what's happening. At Illinois, this kind of kaleidoscope approach is our signature. Over the course of the semester, you will gain a comprehensive, multidisciplinary understanding of the pandemic. The course will guide you through past, present, and future perspectives on what's happening now, with weekly topics that range from history, biology, business, to data security, racial disparities, mental health, and more. Our speakers and moderators, world-class scientists, humanists, social scientists, artists, and community partners will share their knowledge and insight on many of the factors and conditions we are reading about, but want to know more deeply about. Individually and together, their presentations will showcase how interdisciplinary research and expertise can offer unique perspectives on this global health crisis and its consequences. Here at Illinois, we operate on the assumption that the best way to stay safe is to learn more about the pandemic in its many dimensions, and to come together as a community at this time of crisis and uncertainty. This program was built with support from the Office of the Provost, the Carl R. Woese Institute for Genomic Biology, the Center for Social and Behavioral Science, the Humanities Research Institute, the Interdisciplinary Health Sciences Institute, the Siebel Center for Design, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Granger College of Engineering. I speak for all of my colleagues in these units when I say we're delighted to, quote, see you, and to be able to bring such distinguished speakers to the table. Before I introduce this evening's guests, and because we are broadcasting from Urbana-Champaign, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands are the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant university, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role of this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. And now let me turn to introducing our speakers for this evening. Ruby Mendenhall is an associate professor of sociology and African American studies with appointments in urban and regional planning, gender and women's studies, social work, and the Carl R. Woese Institute for Genomic Biology. Professor Mendenhall also is the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Democratization of Health Innovation at the Carle, Illinois College of Medicine. Mendenhall has a broad range of research interests, including how living in racially segregated neighborhoods with high levels of violence affects Black mothers' mental and physical health. She also studies health disparities from a variety of sociological perspectives. In another line of study, Mendenhall employs big data to recover Black women's lost history using topic modeling and data visualization to examine over 800,000 documents from 1740 to 2014. Professor Mendenhall tonight will be joined by Professor Christy Lleras. Professor Lleras is an associate professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies, Her work addresses racial health disparities, educational inequality, and poverty by examining how schools and neighborhoods affect child and adolescent development and maternal well-being. Her recent work examines how exposure to adverse social and environmental experiences, including neighborhood poverty, crime, and access to social support, influence mental and physical health, immune functioning, and disease risk among communities of color. She is also examining how racial segregation in schools and neighborhoods influences child development during the early years of schooling. In line with this work, she has worked for the past 10 years as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division on multiple school desegregation cases. The session tonight will provide the latest information on racial and ethnic disparities in contracting COVID-19 and mortality rates. It will discuss the racial trauma and other socio-structural factors that make individuals more susceptible to the disease and to developing a serious COVID-19 related illness. The presentation will conclude with community level and public policy strategies to mitigate these disparities. Professors Mendenhall and Lleras will take turns speaking. Ruby will begin speaking for the first segment, and then Christy will take over, and then Ruby will follow, and then we'll move to the question and answer period. So with that, I turn things over to Professor Mendenhall.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Going to share my screen. And I always start with saying thank you to our essential workers for the work that they do, for the protection that they provide. And I always put the quote, Dr. King, when he talked about how all labor has dignity, and to say also in terms of the thanks, hopefully at some point it can also be economic dignity in terms of higher pay for essential workers. As Jean mentioned, so we'll talk about understanding racial trauma and intersecting oppressions, right, which really drive a lot of what we're seeing with the excess deaths with COVID-19. And we'll talk about what we know in terms of the health inequities and also COVID-19, how it's playing out. And then really ending with what we can do, and a challenge to all of us to think about how we can apply our knowledge individually and collectively, especially since we are at a land grant institution. And even as I watch the news, right, I think about what can we do, what's happening, what can we do to prevent the tsunami, right, of death that is projected. And then I want to talk about this idea of understanding health inequalities. And I'm using information from a report from Antoinette Burton, where they talked about how the humanities study and teach. It's the study and teaching of everything related to the human experience in its past, present, and future forms, and how that's really important as we look and we see how things are playing out, how it's important to understand individuals within their relationships, which is often family or kin networks, and then community and society, and to think about what it means when individuals are marginalized in those spaces. And also intersectionality, how race, class, gender, religion, sexuality, how all of those are intertwined and individuals experience inclusion or exclusion based on that. And all of that plays a role in health and excess death. And then I want to talk a little bit about Sundiata Chajua in history and African-American studies here. In around 2009, he started talking about his theory, the new nadir. And I remember when I first heard it, I was like, oh my gosh, right? That's a really low point in Black history. And to say that African-Americans are in this new low point was just really hard to hear. But he looked at the historical patterns, he was looking at current conditions. And now, even recently, I wrote him, I was like, wow, right? Like, what are you thinking? What are you theorizing now? But really, when we look at high levels of unemployment, underemployment, hypersegregation, new illiteracy in terms of the digital divide, the class stratification, economic inequality, the Great Recession, the loss of wealth, colorblind ideology, all of these forces coming together to create this context that African Americans find themselves in. And with the conclusion that racism and its intersecting oppressions are often undying and constantly changing. And Frederick Douglass talked about that too, talking about what form would slavery reappear as. And then also work by Helen Neville talks about colorblind ideology and how often people who feel that the society that we've conquered, right, these issues that we talk about, how they often reject programs to improve opportunities and life chances for people of color. And that's really important as we think about, so what's needed both with COVID-19, but what's needed even before COVID and after this pandemic passes. It's really important to think about. And so, and more when I talk about, like, I am a descendant of an enslaved human. Oh, I forgot to set my timer, sorry. And it's important to think about the past, the present, and the future. And so here is a picture of my great aunt. And this is my grandmother, who actually was at a talk with Dr. King. And my great aunt took care of her grandmother, which was my great-great-grandmother. And she told her stories about what it was like to be enslaved. And my great aunt told me those stories. And I talk about this because I want to make it very clear that it was only one person between someone who was a slave and myself, just to show how recent that is in US history. And again, how it continues to play out. My great aunt, she attempted to defy sundown laws, and she stayed in town afterwards, right? And she was beaten because of the fear of her life. And then also she had to do something similar to her son. And I think about when I hear their stories about how humanity is still in question, as I have to tell my two young African-American boys how to respond if they're stopped by police, and in many ways how to submit in order for them to hopefully leave the situation without harm. And so in some ways I have to teach them, just as my ancestors had to learn how to perform their inhumanity. And so that has a toll in terms of racial stress and racial trauma and excess death. And so also we recently looked at 400 years of Black racial trauma, which included the massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a thriving Black business district burned to the ground. Breonna Taylor, we saw what happened with her, and also the recent kind of findings. George Floyd, his death, many people talked about it as a modern day lynching. Some talked about it as Emmett Till, and it sparked not just a national movement, but an international movement. And then the police killings really have a toll both on the families, the extended family, but as I said, sparked a national outcry or international outcry. And so I just want to show a little clip from an incident with Stephon Clark relatives. He was an unarmed Black male who was killed by police in Sacramento. And at the hearing, his brother jumped up on one of the desks and was, really emotional. And some people were making comments about that. So this clip is his aunt, and she's putting it in context. So I started with understanding historically what's happening and what this means, and she provides that context to people. So hold on one second.
His brother Stevante is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Stevante has lost 2 of his brothers. I was over at Stefan's gravesite yesterday, where he is buried on top of his 19-year-old brother. Stevante has lost his older brother. He has lost his baby brother. And he is losing some of his mind. And while everyone has something to say, while everyone wants to talk negative, this is why this baby says we need a resource center. Where are the mental health professionals in our community? He needs help. What you see is not rare. It just had to happen this way, because every single day there is a child that looks just like Stevante, who is running around here, who looks half crazy to the world, but you don't know the damage that's done inside. We are living in communities that are like war zones. You don't know what it's like to go to the home that you grew up in, and feet from the couch you lay on, your brother was murdered in his grandmother's backyard. You don't know the pain that his grandfather feels from hearing him knock on the window for help. Let's take our outrage, but let's use it for something positive. He will not be another name added to a list. We are too strong. We are too united. And it is time for things to change.
Okay. All right, so that emotional, very emotional clip, but again, showing the toll that it takes, the mental toll. And we know from research, sociogenomics, right? Gene Robinson is spearheading some of this, and epigenetics, how stress gets under the skin to affect health. And then on top of that, in Chicago, right, the infrastructure, mental health infrastructure was drastically cut, 2009 to 2012, $187 million cut in terms of diagnostic and treatment. 2012, Dr. Bell's community mental health councils were closed. They were running for 37 years, and the estimate was that it treated over 26,000 patients at its peak, and many of those patients were African Americans. And we know this iceberg, right? When we talk about social determinants of health, I was at the National Institutes of Health, and they put the iceberg up, and they talked about how individuals that come into the doctor's office with, you know, chronic conditions, and they talked about how underneath that are social determinants of health, the ways we structure society is influencing the diseases that people come in with. And some of those include education, the built environment, toxins, but also segregation with limited resources, lack of education, discrimination, lots of research. I do some of it on how it affects health, mental and physical. And many are pushing for putting funding into prevention. So we'll talk about that later, prevention and wellness strategies, mental health workers, economic development, housing. And again, Stephane Clark, she said it, like, where are the resources in these communities that are hard hit? And in terms of disparities, social determinants, housing is a really big one. So many people are familiar with redlining maps that show how federal housing created sections that they would fund and provide home loans and mortgage insurance, and sections where they would not, and how that set a trajectory that has led to what we see now with low rates of Black home ownership compared to whites, which is the line at the top. Also Latinx with low home ownership. This study that was done in Illinois shows that African Americans are 8 times more likely to be homeless than white individuals. And we know in COVID, this is important in terms of hand washing, being able to shelter in place. And then the report also showed that 23 out of the 25 areas with the highest levels of evictions are in Black communities. And we can only see that escalating as individuals lose jobs, as they try to double up, and then those individuals lose jobs. So that's really some issues that we have to think about, how to address that in the midst of a pandemic. And then when you think about inequalities and the toll that they take, David Satcher and colleagues, they did work and they found that there were 83,000 excess Black deaths a year. So meaning Blacks were dying at a higher rate than you would expect from old age or from having diseases and getting sick. And in the documentary, they talked about that as a plane full of African Americans falling out the sky every day, every year, right? That's the toll of racism. That's the toll of the intersecting oppressions. And then also Rodriguez and colleagues did work and looked at it from 1970 to 2004 and found 2.7 million excess Black deaths. And so imagine all of those planes falling to the sky. And then with COVID, it sped it up, right? So many people were surprised at seeing the high rates of death among people of color, but many people have been doing this work. We are not surprised, right? Because it's been happening, it's been every day. And now a lot of attention is drawn towards it. And then just some numbers in terms of how the social inequality, excess death, how it's playing out in terms of cases. American Indians are, and really American Indians, Blacks and Latinx, almost 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with COVID-19, almost 5 times as likely to be hospitalized, and then African Americans, almost twice as likely to die from it. And those are stats from CDC. And then APM Research Lab, they talked about if groups had died of COVID-19 at the same actual rate as white Americans, about 20,800 Black Americans, 10,900 Latinx, and 80 Pacific Islander Americans would still be alive. And then this chart shows that in 13 states, including District of Columbia, African Americans are dying at disproportionate higher rates. You see the pink, I guess orange, yeah, I guess orange, and then even the darker orange indicates almost a 300% increase in deaths than what you would expect if people were dying at the same rates. And then here are numbers for Illinois. So indigenous individuals are in this lighter green. These are Asian Americans, and then Latinx here. I'm sorry, the green is Black, and then this blue is Latinx, and then this is white. And again, kind of showing the disproportionate number of deaths in the state. And then I will turn it over to Christy. I'm gonna stop sharing. And then, so Christy, we've had questions about why the racial disparities exist. So Christy is going to show how the historical and current racism that I've talked about and other intersecting oppressions are playing out in the current pandemic to create excess death. And then some of the factors that she'll talk about include who are the essential workers, and then who are more likely to live in multi-generational homes. And so Christy, do you mind taking it away and talking about some of these factors?
Thank you, Ruby. I'm just gonna share my screen too. Okay, so in thinking about some of the social and economic factors that are sort of driving the disproportionate burden that COVID-19 has had on communities of color, certainly the presence of comorbidity is one reason. So as we heard from Dr. Brinkworth a few weeks ago in this series, the fact that racial and ethnic minority populations have a disproportionate burden of sort of underlying comorbidities like cardiovascular disease and asthma, type 2 diabetes, certainly accounts for some, but not all of the disparities. And there's been a growing number of studies, a few in the last few weeks in Milwaukee and New York, that suggest that sort of once age, sex, poverty status, neighborhood disadvantage, as well as comorbidities are controlled for, Black patients were still 5 times more likely to test positive for COVID, suggesting that we need to consider other kinds of factors. And certainly we're seeing this from the medical community, this sort of increasing attention paid to systemic racism, as Ruby was discussing, and how and why racial and ethnic minorities might be at higher risk for contracting the disease and developing serious illness. So I'll talk about some of the things that I was thinking about. So according to the CDC, Ruby's right. We're supposed to stay home if possible, and especially if we're sick, and we're supposed to practice social distancing. So as a sociologist, the first thing that came to my mind, along with many others, is the idea that social distancing is really a privilege. So what do I mean by that? So certainly being able to work from home is part of this privilege. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, African American and Latino workers are much less likely to be able to work from home compared to white workers. In part, this is kind of due to the different kinds of occupations that Black and Latino workers are concentrated in. So again, if we look at BLS data, we can see that Black and Hispanic workers are concentrated in industries, including transportation and sales, and for Latino workers, construction. So occupations that are largely public facing, and many of which were deemed essential jobs during the pandemic. So in addition, we can see national data showing us that Black workers are actually disproportionately in jobs that are considered those frontline industries, like child and healthcare workers, social workers, transit workers, and people working in grocery stores and convenience stores. And these jobs are also much more likely to be those frontline jobs that are essential, and sort of forcing them to take their own health and their family's health and kind of sacrifice that in order to make a living. A recent study from the Joint Center for Housing shows that about 1/3 of all households have at least one person who's in a high proximity job. These are kind of close contact with the public jobs, but the incidence is not evenly distributed across the population. So as we might expect, we've got approximately 40% of Black households, 45% of Hispanic households having at least one high proximity worker compared to 34% of white households. So in thinking about privilege, another factor to consider is whether you can stay home if you're sick without risking a loss of income or employment. And again, if we look at BLS data, we can see that if Black and Latino workers become sick, they're much less likely than white workers to have jobs that provide sick leave. And despite the passage of the ACA or Obamacare, which expanded health insurance coverage to about 30 million Americans, in large part through Medicaid expansion, as of 2018, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islanders remain much more likely to be uninsured compared to whites. Again, if we look at a statement from the Joint Center for Housing study at Harvard, estimating that at least 5.4 million households are at high risk of spreading COVID because residents work in close contact with the public. They're in those front-facing jobs that are considered essential during the pandemic, and they do not have enough space to be isolated at home. So piggyback on what Ruby was talking about in terms of housing, if we look at a recent study by Conan Passel at the Pew Research Center, a record 64 million American households are multi-generational households. And Black, Hispanic, and Asian households are much more likely to live in these multi-generational households compared to whites. So this is a graph showing the share of all households by race and ethnicity. So all the way to the left, the column shows Black households in orange, Hispanic households in yellow, and Asian households in green. The bars in the middle of this graph show that Black, Hispanic, and Asian households are much more likely to be multi-generational and have at least one high proximity worker. So someone in close contact with the public. The data on the right shows that multi-generational households are also more likely to live in overcrowded conditions. More than 3/4 of these very vulnerable households in this position are headed by a person of color. So indeed, many communities of color are facing what we call this kind of triple threat, having more households with high proximity workers, a higher likelihood of living in overcrowded conditions, and a greater incidence of multi-generational living arrangements. So part of the privilege is also about the ability to sustain monthly income. But we know that the Black, white, and Hispanic white wage gaps are large, and they exist across all education groups. So this is data from 2019 from the US Census. The final graph I'm going to show you, and then I'll turn it right back over to Ruby, is just looking at the job loss. So trying to compare the job loss between the Great Recession in December 2007 to December 2009, and then recently from February through July during the pandemic. So here we can see that in the Great Recession, Black Americans lost 7.7% of their jobs, while white Americans lost 5.4% and Hispanic Americans lost 4.6%. But the job losses due to COVID have been significantly greater. So in the red, you can see the job loss from COVID. And since February, Black Americans have lost 13% of their jobs to the pandemic, nearly twice what they lost in the Great Recession. Asian and Hispanic Americans have lost similar amounts, while white Americans have lost approximately 8.9% of their jobs. So in both the Great Recession and the current recession, Black Americans have lost about 1.4 times as many jobs proportionally as white Americans, despite starting from higher levels of unemployment than white Americans. So Ruby, another aspect I was thinking about when trying to understand these racial and ethnic differences in COVID, and certainly another aspect of privilege, is the ability to kind of isolate in a safe home and safe neighborhoods. So I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about that.
All right, so yes, the ability to live in safe neighborhoods is near and dear to my heart. I've done a lot of research on that. I've talked to a lot of mothers and some others who've lost their children to gun violence. So it's something, and it's important to recognize that we're in the middle of a pandemic. But again, we have a pandemic within a pandemic, as we've talked about with the excess death. But then we also have the police murders. We have social unrest. We have communities that have less resources before the social unrest than they do now. For example, someone that I talked with talked about a Walmart in Chicago that remains closed. And so people now have to go further in order to get their food and also to get their medicine. We have to think about the job loss, as Christy said, food insecurity. We've seen on the news people waiting hours in line, and then the gun violence. So research is showing as of May 2020 that the shootings were up from last year by 71% and murders up by 60%. So again, when I first started this and I talked about understanding the context and all the things that are taking place, it's important to understand this context as well. And I think we're short on time, so I'm not going to show the clip from What's Left Behind, a documentary that we're working on, but if you Google What's Left Behind, either my name or Lisa Butler, you should be able to see it. It's about 2.5 minutes, but it's just parents talking about the grief and the pain and the struggle that happens when they lose children. And it's also important to know that the grief and the pain, it's not just contained in the family, that it ripples out into the whole community, right? It ripples out to me. Many people have received emails from me, like I'm in tears, like this has happened and this has happened. And one mother, she said that her son, there were 500 people at his funeral. And she was like, wow, I didn't even know he touched 500 people's lives. So that's something to just kind of think about. So in terms of the psychological cost of this, adults see it, but the children see it as well. They're not immune to it. One of the women that I talked to, she talked about my kids' friends have been shot. My kids' friends have died. It's not just only stress for adults, it's a lot on the kids, and kids ask a lot of questions about the violence. And she talked about they're scared, they don't want to go to school, they're crying. And then I asked, like, you know, is there counseling like Sandy Hook? Because it was near that time. And she says no, and she puts up her hand in air quotes. But she says, you know, the counselor's never there. I'll call, they say, oh, call me in the morning, we're busy right now. And she said, I tried 3 times. After the 3rd time, I quit. But it's important to know that the trauma that the children seeing, that doesn't quit, right? They still have it. In many ways, it's unprocessed. And again, as I talked about, affecting their mental health, but also their physical health, most likely. And some of the mothers, they talked about almost 100 mothers I interviewed, about half of them reported depressive symptoms, about 56% PTSD symptoms. They talked about having headaches, backaches, stomach pains, hair falling out, loss of taste. And it was interesting when I heard a lot of people talk about that as being one of the side effects or one of the things associated with COVID-19. Loss of sexual desire, research that Jean and I are doing where we look at the genes that regulate the immune system and how those are affected, the functioning is affected by stress. And then also Black women faculty, right? So I'm talking about mostly low-income Black women in stressful neighborhoods in Inglewood, but also Black women faculty that I know talk about some of the same things with the headaches and the back pains, and talk about this racial trauma and how in some ways, right, it manifests differently, but that it's still there causing issues around health and wellness. And so we will end there and go to our Q&A part of this session.
So we received a lot of great questions, and hopefully the presentations actually answered some of those, particularly about what factors may be driving the health disparities in COVID-19. And certainly the large racial disparities in COVID mortality is something we should be really concerned about. One of the things I was thinking about as some of the questions also pertain to this was sort of, what about the people who contract COVID and suffer from the illness but ultimately recover? So Ruby, can you talk a little bit about what scientists are saying about the possible lingering effects of having the disease?
Yes. So Jennifer Kuzin-Frankel, she wrote an article in Science July 31st, 2020, and she talked about, her and her colleagues, how about 10 to 15% of individuals with COVID will have long-term symptoms. And these include fatigue. So one person talked about that they fall asleep all day long and can't go back to work. One person talked about how they were infected in March, but then they haven't been able to return to work all these months later. Racing heartbeat, lung scarring, shortness of breath, achy joints, impaired mobility, headaches, foggy thinking, mental health problems, persistent loss of sense of smell, as I talked about earlier with the mother who lost her son to gun violence, damage to the kidneys, damage to the gut. In fact, there's a study that's coming out now that has listed 62 different symptoms, right, associated with lingering effects of COVID. And so I also wanted to talk about some concerns, right? And you've heard many of them talked about in the news. Would it be another factor creating, or for me, right, creating sickness and premature death in marginalized groups? And that's important to understand who gets the lingering conditions and then under what context. So we could do study and try to prevent some of that. And then also around health insurance, right? Is this going to be considered another pre-existing condition and locking some people out of access to care? And will it become a stigmatized disease, right? We still are not, we're still in the throes of it, and we don't know how we will act as it lingers on and as society continues to be in an upheaval around it. So Christy, let me ask you a question, right? So along these same lines, we have questions about the role of comorbidities in understanding the racial disparities in contracting and dying from COVID-19. And so with the racial differences, we're seeing are largely a result of underlying conditions like the flu, pneumonia, respiratory failure, hypertension, diabetes. But then the question to you is, can you help us to understand the role of comorbidities in COVID-19?
Yeah, so the CDC released a report recently, right, showing that 94% of US deaths involve COVID-19. And they also published in the report that 6%, only for 6% of the deaths was COVID-19 reported as the only cause mentioned. And in thinking about that, we might jump to the conclusion that it's all about a comorbidity. It's all a comorbidity story. But I agree with Justin Lessler. He's an epidemiologist from Johns Hopkins. He said the findings from the CDC report that comorbidities are kind of increasing your risk of dying from COVID-19 is not really surprising. And this would probably be true for most any kind of disease, including sort of the flu or cancer or chickenpox even, right? Your risk of death is certainly going to increase if you have other diseases or conditions that make you sick. So I sort of am in that camp. And I think there's a growing number of medical professionals, but scientists and researchers who are arguing for increased research into something other than comorbidities to understand what's really happening.
And so another question for you. So we've talked a lot tonight about factors, what factors we should consider when trying to understand racial disparities in COVID-19 and the effects of this disease on many different groups. So can you say more about how it's affecting children?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the alarming trends is that we have seen an uptick, an increase in adolescent depression and suicide during the pandemic. So that's something that we should be very concerned about. In terms of educational outcomes, which is a little more my area of expertise as a sociologist of education, something that I'm particularly concerned about is that online learning is pretty effective, or much more effective, let's say, if you have access to the internet and to teachers. So I'm worried about, you mentioned earlier in your talk, Ruby, the digital divide. So as of 2018, I mean, national data is suggesting that fully 1/4 of all school-age children either do not have a computer or high-speed internet or both. That's a lot. That's 1 in 4 kids who doesn't have what they need in order to learn during the pandemic. And we know that within every racial and ethnic group, these percentages are much higher for those families who live in poverty. So in Chicago, for example, the percent of kids without access to the internet is substantially higher in the high poverty, racially segregated neighborhoods like Inglewood, where 46% of kids under the age of 18 living in Inglewood on the south side of Chicago do not have access to the internet. There was a recent estimate that suggested at least 20% of Chicago families are not connected to the internet. So that's something I think about a lot, how this is going to impact that. Another thing is that we know already that low-income kids and kids who are a little bit below average tend to learn, their learning kind of drops off during the summer months. It's called summer fallback. The sort of loss of learning over those times when children are not in school. And so in thinking about the fact that low-income kids are just much more likely to lose ground in terms of learning when they're not in school, compared to middle-class kids who tend to gain during those summer months. They actually do, they come into school even better than they left school. So that gets me really worried about socioeconomic achievement gaps. And I would expect that over this pandemic, already those existing gaps that we have in achievement are going to get bigger. And they're going to further widen during this pandemic. And the fact that they're doing that makes me really worried about this sort of gap in learning opportunities that lower income kids are going to have access to. So those are the things that keep me up at night.
Yeah, and then even I was talking to a social service agency, and they talked about how for some families, low-income families, they have to pay like $10 a month for internet access, but even that's a lot of money, right? So then I think we have to think of ways to ensure that all families have access to internet so that their children can be educated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even when thinking about that and knowing that these are the families that are often the ones facing the decision of whether to go to work because they need to work, and whether they have anything in reserves, right? Whether the wage gaps are so substantial now that, do you have anything in reserve? Can you afford to not go into work today?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it feels like we've talked a lot about the factors that we need to consider when we're trying to think about COVID. I think we want some solutions now, like maybe we'll shift the conversation and start thinking or kind of looking forward to some strategies for mitigating some of these disparities. So Ruby, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot. We're here at a land-grant university, right? That's part of our legacy in terms of taking knowledge and resources and taking it to the community. And at this point, I think that everyone really has to be an expert on their health. And so I propose, and I'm thinking about this idea of community health workers. Mm-hmm. There are different training spots. Morehouse, they actually do training where they train high school students, right? Juniors and seniors, and also young adults to go out into the community. They recently added contact tracing to that, but also to help talk with individuals about chronic diseases and seeing what they need. So we saw Governor Cuomo call in the Army Corps of Engineers, right, to help build hospitals and capacity. I think on some levels we need to think about how do we do that? How can everyone understand how the body works, how stress gets under the skin to influence health and well-being, and also the role of art and other kind of healing modalities too, right? And then also I think there was this one study that talked about doctors who asked their patients about their interior. The example, the patients did better. So an example was a doctor was treating someone who had a cold, a student, and said, wow, it must be hard to have a cold. I know you're taking finals. And research showed that doctors who asked about the interior like that, even if it was 30 seconds, that the people, they got well quicker and that their immune system was stronger. And so we need to, I think, take this research, what we know from the evidence, and then make sure we can translate that to the community so that they know what works and what doesn't. And also included in that is trauma-informed research and wraparound services. We've worked with foster grandparents just before COVID-19 hit, and what the stories that they told me and the amount of resources that they provided to families, I was just astounded. And a lot of it is creating this community and knowing that there are people, when you have issues, that they can help to find a way to help. So I'll see if you have others, and then I have some more too.
Oh yeah, no, so thinking about that, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is vaccine distribution. So trust in the vaccine. So can you talk a little bit about that? What do we expect to see? I was encouraged, I think, by the CDC's recommendations about who is going to get the vaccine first, and the attention paid to understanding that this has hit communities of color hardest. But I'm a bit skeptical, just given history. So do you want to comment a little bit about vaccines? And then if there is one provided, how do we build trust in communities of color so that people will, feel okay getting this vaccine?
Yeah, so I mean, I just think working with the community is really important, and not even after the vaccine is developed, right? As the vaccine is being developed, to have the communities there at the table, at the scientific meetings, at the writing of the results, I think is critical. And as we talked about before, kind of understanding the history of people of color in this community and in this country, and how trust is really a big issue, from Tuskegee experiments to all of that. And I don't know, have you read anything where people are trying to think about the issue of trust? They are linking it to past experiences. And I'll just talk, when we did the genomic research in Chicago with Black women, we had focus groups, and we asked them, said, we want to do a study where we're going to come and ask for blood, right? What do you think? How should we approach it? And because in our kind of team meetings, we didn't know, right? So we were African American, but we didn't know if the women would be like, get out of here, like I'm not giving you one drop of my blood, or I will. And they talked about trust, right? And they talked about the need to be very clear what you're doing. So we said, right, we're not trying to determine any health issues or anything like that. We're trying to see how stress affects your immune system. And many of the women were really interested in the study because, as I said before, they were having headaches, backaches, stomach aches, and they knew that their bodies weren't functioning like they should be functioning. So all of that to say, it has to be community, I even want to say driven, or at least in close partnership with it. And that kind of leads into another thing that I was going to say, funding for more community-based science, citizen science in an inclusive way, so citizen community science, and for it to be pathways to these health fields, right? So even the people who are developing vaccines, they look like people from the communities, right? They bring those community concerns, they bring the history of those communities around the table. So there's a study that I thought was interesting. It's the COVID-19 symptom study. And they have 4,312,429 people in that study from the US, Sweden, and London. And I couldn't find a breakdown of race, ethnicity, or class or anything like that. But I think it's very profound, right? To be able to get that much information from people and use that information to drive health and wellness to drive vaccines and other things. And for people to feel like they have the buy-in, that they are part of the scientific community, I think is really key. And then they're also doing a study, I think is more in the UK, where they're going to follow 10,000 people for 1 to 25 years. And they have apps associated with that to be able to get that data on a regular basis. And I'll say, like, on a small level, Robin Wilson and I are doing something like that. We are working with citizen community scientists who are journaling about their COVID-19 experience across the state of Illinois, and their farmers, their individuals who are homeless, youth. It's just a range of individuals, and we want to take those stories and create policy for the people, particularly health policy.
Yeah, so in thinking about that too, the role of so we've been talking today a lot about sort of all the things that produce chronic stress, right? So, and the idea that the pandemic has exacerbated in astronomical ways the stress that families, particularly low income, working class families and communities of color, right? And so thinking about that, I've been thinking a lot about housing insecurity. So you talked a little bit about that, but it feels like we've got a moment where we've got kind of national attention. And I don't know about you, but I haven't been, it doesn't seem like we've talked about affordable housing this much ever. So it feels like it's kind of thrust the housing crisis that we've been suffering for many decades into the forefront. And so in thinking about sort of housing and housing insecurity, where do you think we're going in the future on that with this?
Yeah, I'll say where I think we should go. And I've, spent a lot of time kind of thinking about this. I've talked with people. One thing is to address social determinants of health, period, right? Like the racism, poverty, the inadequate housing, and also the need for wealth creation. And so housing falls into that. And I think that, I recently gave a talk to legislators, and I talked about the importance of innovation and policy, right? Like legislation is often kind of in increments. And I think we have to think about quantum leaps and what can we do that hasn't been done before. And I gave the example of Frances Perkins, right? She was the first female Secretary of Labor during the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression. And just some of the things that she did in terms of unemployment relief. I mean, she worked in coalitions, but she spearheaded it to the point that some people talked about the New Deal as the Perkins New Deal, right? That's how instrumental she was with unemployment relief, 40 hours a week work, abolition of child labor, Social Security, like the list was going on. And as I watched the documentary, I was like, wow, like how did she do all that? The boldness, the audaciousness. And I think that needs to happen. So going to your question about housing, there are several of us here. We put in a grant to create small, affordable, smart housing, right? So housing that's fairly small and it's built with innovative materials. So that's where the Maker Lab and others on campus who are thinking about this. Wendy Rogers, she's doing work in this area where you build them and they're affordable. So maybe they're 30, 40,000 where low-income families who get the earned income tax credit, they can pay that house off in 3, 4, 5 years. And the rest of that money, they're accumulating wealth. It's an asset that they then can pass down to their children. So that's the small, that's the affordable. And then healing, right? To put in some of the latest technology around smart toilets, to put in maybe health mirrors where it can do facial recognition and see, we have this technology out already, and kind of see how people's moods are going. And if they're starting to shift, if they're starting to feel grief, depression, trigger symptoms, that they then can get help and resources for that. What else? And then also just kind of rebuilding the safety net in general. And again, connecting innovation, connecting the humanities, connecting the arts, medicine, all of it, so that we do as a society, again, think of innovative ways where everyone can thrive, right? Where it's not the zero sum game, but that there's enough resources, there's enough innovation, so that people don't have to be on the margins, right? People don't have to have this access depth with a plane full of individuals falling out the sky every day, every year. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ruby.
And then I think we turn it over to Dr. Robinson for the closing comments.
Yes, closing comments. I'd like to thank both of you for your insights and the way in which you really shared this tragic dimension of this tragedy, yet another tragic dimension of this tragedy. And I think that your creative and insightful advocacy is really important right now, and hopefully can lead to the kind of insights that that can help address this part of the pandemic. Your work, both of you, what you do day in and day out is so important to address disparities, and now more so than ever before. So we want to, again, thank you very much for taking the time and for sharing with us. And there's a list of readings for those of you that are interested in learning more. There's a list of readings will be posted to the website, the course website, under this class. So I urge you to look into that further. So I'd like to say good night. Thank you again to our speakers. Good night, stay well, stay healthy, and please join us next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.